Thursday. That is how long it took. The executive order banning Canadian firms from American government contracts was signed Monday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Canada had signed replacement contracts with European governments worth more in total value than every American government contract the ban had targeted combined. 4 days. Not 4 months, not 4 years. 4 days between a ban designed to remove Canadian firms from the most lucrative public procurement market on Earth and the signing of agreements that made the removal commercially irrelevant before the week was over. The administration announced the ban, expecting Canadian construction companies, engineering firms, technology providers, and professional services organizations to spend months scrambling to find alternative revenue, while the pressure of that scrambling produced the political force required to move Ottawa. Canada had spent 8 months making sure that scrambling was not necessary. The European contracts had been under negotiation since last spring. They were ready to sign. They were waiting for the moment the American market closed enough doors that signing them publicly served both the commercial purpose and the sovereign statement simultaneously. Monday's ban closed the doors. Thursday's signing served both. And the week that passed between them is now the most concise summary of how this confrontation has operated since its first day. Washington applies pressure. Ottawa converts the pressure into something permanent that works better than what the pressure was designed to destroy. The procurement ban itself was genuinely consequential in the narrow terms of what it targeted. American federal government contracts represent the single largest public procurement market on Earth. The federal government purchases approximately $700 billion in goods and services annually from private sector contractors, covering everything from defense systems to office furniture to cloud computing infrastructure, to highway construction, to medical equipment, to satellite communications, to cybersecurity services. Canadian firms have been significant participants in that market for decades, operating under bilateral procurement agreements that gave them access to American federal contracting opportunities on terms comparable to those available to American domestic firms. The ban reversed that access completely, overnight, without a transition period, without carve-outs for contracts already in execution, without grandfathering arrangements for Canadian firms that had already mobilized resources, hired staff, and incurred costs in preparation for contract performance that the ban now prohibited. The legal basis the administration cited was a national security determination that Canadian government conduct throughout the bilateral trade confrontation had created conditions under which Canadian firm participation in American federal contracting represented an unacceptable risk to American government operations and sensitive procurement programs. The legal authority for national security-based procurement restrictions is genuine and has been used in American procurement law for decades, primarily to exclude firms from countries with adversarial relationships with the United States: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. The firms of those nations are excluded from American federal contracting through mechanisms rooted in the same legal framework the administration invoked Monday morning against Canadian firms. The application of adversarial nation procurement exclusion mechanisms to the firms of a G7 ally, a NATO partner, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, and the nation's largest trading partner produced the specific quality of international procurement law community reaction that occurs when an instrument is deployed so far outside its intended domain that the deployment itself becomes the story rather than its target. 3 major American law firms with federal procurement practices published client alerts within hours of the ban's announcement, describing its legal basis as unprecedented and its application to Canadian firms as likely to generate significant legal challenge from multiple directions simultaneously. American firms that had been operating as subcontractors to Canadian prime contractors on active federal projects contacted their congressional representatives before the business day ended, asking how the ban applied to work already underway and what liability exposure they faced from Canadian prime contractor non-performance on active contracts. The General Services Administration, which administers the federal procurement system, issued internal guidance to contracting officers describing the ban's application parameters that 3 procurement attorneys described publicly as evidence of the operational complexity involved in implementing an overnight exclusion of a significant established participant in the federal contractor base. None of that complexity produced the political effect the ban was designed to produce, because the political effect the ban was designed to produce required Canadian firms to have no place to go. The assumption embedded in the ban's design was that Canadian procurement-dependent firms would immediately begin generating intense pressure on their provincial and federal governments to seek resolution with Washington on whatever terms were available. That the prospect of sustained exclusion from American federal contracting revenue would produce a constituency of affected Canadian businesses whose political voice was loud enough and whose economic pain was immediate enough to overcome the institutional resistance that Carney's government had been maintaining throughout the confrontation. The assumption required Canadian firms to be more dependent on American government contracts than they were prepared for the American government contract market to close. 8 months of preparation had made them less dependent than the assumption required. The European framework agreements that Canada had been negotiating since last spring covered 7 categories of government procurement across 12 European nations: infrastructure construction, digital transformation services, defense-adjacent technology, environmental engineering, healthcare systems integration, aerospace maintenance and overhaul, and professional advisory services across public sector modernization programs that European governments had been funding at significant scale as part of post-pandemic recovery and green transition investment programs. Canadian firms had been engaged in pre-qualification discussions with European procurement agencies throughout the preceding months. They had been building the compliance frameworks, the local partnership arrangements, and the regulatory alignment documentation that European government contracting requires. The ban gave both sides the political and commercial incentive to move from pre-qualification to signature. On Thursday afternoon, they signed. The combined value of the European procurement framework agreements announced Thursday was $94 billion over 10 years. The American federal contracting revenue that Canadian firms had been generating annually before the ban was estimated by the Professional Services Council of Canada at approximately $8 billion per year. Across the 10-year horizon of the European agreements, the replacement revenue exceeded the lost American revenue by a factor that made the mathematics of the ban immediately visible to every Canadian firm executive who calculated it. The ban had been designed to close a door that was worth $8 billion annually. Canada opened a different door worth $94 billion over a decade. The door Canada opened was not as convenient geographically as the one that closed. European procurement involves different regulatory frameworks, different compliance requirements, different local partnership obligations, and different operational logistics than American federal contracting. The transition is real work. But the replacement revenue is real money, and real money on a 10-year horizon produces the kind of institutional commitment that makes going back through the original door less commercially necessary with every contract year that passes. The Canadian firms that signed the European frameworks on Thursday were not uniformly the same firms that had been most dependent on American federal contracting. The ban's disruption was not evenly distributed across the Canadian procurement industry. Firms that had been building their European market presence for years, that had already established the partnerships and the compliance infrastructure, and the operational relationships that European contracting requires, moved fastest. They were ready. The firms that were most dependent on the American market and least prepared for alternative markets faced the most acute short-term disruption. Their pain was real, and Carney's government addressed it through a transitional support program announced Wednesday that provided bridge financing, market access advisory services, and European partnership facilitation for affected firms, while the framework agreements created the framework within which their transition could proceed. The political pressure the ban was designed to generate arrived, but it arrived directed at Washington rather than at Ottawa. The American firms that had been operating as Canadian subcontractor partners on federal projects faced contract performance disruptions that their American prime contractor relationships had not anticipated. Defense contractors whose Canadian subcontractors provided specialized engineering and systems integration services that the ban now prohibited from American federal contracts were required to find replacement capabilities on compressed timelines at premium costs. Infrastructure project sponsors, whose Canadian engineering firms had been engaged through competitive procurement processes that had already concluded, faced contract restructuring costs when the ban prevented Canadian firms from continuing performance. The American procurement industry that had been a beneficiary of Canadian firm participation in the federal contractor base discovered that the ban disrupted its own operations in ways that generated its own political pressure pointed at the administration rather than at Ottawa. The National Defense Industrial Association released a statement Thursday afternoon describing the procurement ban as creating significant supply chain disruption for defense acquisition programs that depended on Canadian firm participation in ways that could not be quickly replaced. The statement listed specific capability areas where Canadian firms had provided specialized services to American defense programs that the domestic American contractor base did not replicate at equivalent quality and price. It was not a statement of political solidarity with Canada. It was a statement of operational alarm from an American industry organization whose member firms were facing the practical consequences of a ban that had been designed to pressure Canadian firms without adequately modeling the operational dependencies those Canadian firms had built into the American defense acquisition ecosystem. The European reaction to Thursday's signing was the specific kind of institutional enthusiasm that comes from governments that have been watching an allied nation demonstrate sovereign resilience for 18 months and are genuinely pleased to deepen their commercial relationship with a government whose conduct they have consistently assessed as principled. The European Commissioner for Internal Market released a statement welcoming the Canadian procurement framework agreements as a significant expansion of democratic allied commercial partnership, and expressing the European Union's intention to accelerate additional framework development across sectors where Canadian capability and European government demand aligned. Germany's Federal Ministry for Digital and Transport Affairs announced separately that Canadian technology firms had been selected for pre-qualification in 3 major digital infrastructure programs currently in procurement. The United Kingdom's Cabinet Office released a statement describing the Canadian procurement partnership as consistent with the bilateral trade relationship deepening that both governments had been pursuing throughout the period of Canadian-American trade disruption. The markets that processed Thursday's announcement were markets that had been watching this confrontation long enough to understand what the replacement revenue math meant for the BANS pressure calculus. The professional services and construction sector components of the Toronto Stock Exchange rose as the European framework agreements provided revenue visibility that reduced the uncertainty premium that the BANS announcement had introduced Monday. American defense contractor stocks fell modestly as analysts incorporated the supply chain disruption costs identified in the National Defense Industrial Association statement into their operational cost models. The Canadian dollar's now 20-week pattern of strengthening continued uninterrupted as markets processed a ban designed to close the American procurement market and a replacement that opened the European procurement market before the closing week had ended. What the administration does next with the procurement ban is the question that every affected party on both sides is trying to answer. The ban cannot be quietly walked back without acknowledging that the replacement agreements Canada signed Thursday have changed the commercial landscape in ways that make the original pressure calculation obsolete, regardless of what happens to the ban. Canadian firms that have signed 10-year European framework agreements have institutional commitments that do not dissolve when the American market reopens. The procurement relationships being built in European markets are real business relationships with real contract performance obligations and real local partnership structures that persist independently of the bilateral Canadian-American political situation. The door that opened on Thursday does not close simply because the door that closed on Monday reopens. Commercial relationships do not work that way. Procurement frameworks do not work that way. And the European governments that signed those frameworks did not sign them as temporary arrangements pending American-Canadian reconciliation. They signed them because Canadian firms offer genuine value and because deepening their commercial relationship with Canada serves their own institutional interests, regardless of what happens in North America. Monday's ban was issued with the expectation that 4 days later, Canadian firms would be scrambling for alternatives in markets they had not prepared. 4 days later, Canadian firms were signing contracts worth more than the ban had taken. The week between the ban and the signing is a week worth understanding, not because it contained any dramatic confrontation or any significant statement from either government, because it contained nothing except the execution of preparation that had been underway for 8 months before the ban gave the preparation its occasion. The ban gave Canada the occasion, the preparation gave Canada the answer, and Thursday gave the world the arithmetic. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to understand how this confrontation is actually operating beneath the headlines. We are on this story every day. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.